It's Ollie here, the lone boardsman, and today we're looking at Soviet Dawn, the Russian Civil War, 1918 to 1921. Reds, whites, greens, Czechs, Poles, armored trains, and political chaos and disorder. Can the Soviet Union be born in the chaos of the end of the First World War? So we're just going to have a look at the description. So Soviet Dawn Deluxe Edition. So this is the deluxe edition of the game. Originally brought, the game came out, was written by Darin Levioff, who is the kind of creator of the States of Siege series. Game's back for a much larger storytelling adventure covering the Russian Civil War from 1918 to 21. With several enemy fronts converging on Moscow, the fate of the revolution and the prestige of international communism rests on your ability to manage and resolve every crisis that they can assail you with. As the headlines unfold, you draw upon military and political resources to help you, or try to reorganize the Red Army for special abilities that can greatly enhance your position. Who knows, you might even be able to capture the Imperial Gold Reserve. Can you deal with the great crisis of that time and defend the revolution? Will you withdraw from the Great War, World War One, or exercise the Bukharin option and fight on? Can you execute the Tsar in time, or will the Whites rescue him? Will you fortify Petrograd or press your offensives home? How will you deal with internal and external dissent? Play Soviet Dawn and see. So this is a States of Siege game. You can see the lobby board here. This one, so it's a deluxe edition, which is a remake of a kind of one of the older games in the States of Siege series, as I said, and by the original designer Darin. This one is basically covering the Russian Civil War. And this is one of the most complicated pieces of political history out there, so I'm not going to really give it justice. I'm sure I would get some things wrong, but broadly what we're talking about is at the end of the First World War, the Tsar has been overthrown by the provisional government under Alexander Kerensky. They continue to fight the Germans in World War One. But there's lots of problems and internal dissent inside. And then there's the October Revolution, where our main characters, Lenin, Trotsky, Bukharin, come in, and this is who you're playing. You're playing these early communist leaders, and you're trying to fend off multiple threats. So to start with, you're not just dealing with the German forces advancing in the Baltic, so the World War One German army. You're now dealing with the Whites, who are kind of counter-revolutionary forces in the east. You've got Kolchak, and in the south, Denikin, and these are kind of conservatives. But there's also a mix of other nationalists, local forces, Tatars. There's all sorts of different forces that are trying to stop communism in the bed, and that's in the cradle, before it's born. And they all have their different reasons, and perhaps their disunity is one of the reasons why communism survived this war, despite many threats. And we've also got the Poles as well, that come in much later, and the Finns. The British and the US come in later as well. So basically, how does this game work? What are you trying to achieve? So you're playing. Just to jump back a little bit. So essentially, what's happening is you're playing the Soviet forces, the Reds. You're playing a States of Siege game, and what that means is you've got multiple tracks here, like all around, and these are converging on Moscow, and like most States of Siege games, these will advance on you as the game goes through, and you lose if they reach Moscow, basically. But what makes this one slightly different than other States of Siege games is that there's two ways you can win. So one way to win is you go through the cards, and there's 3 decks of cards. Yes, you've got the Dusk cards, which are the beginning of the conflict. You've then got the Darkness cards, and then you've got the Dawn cards as the game comes to an end. And these kind of can get shuffled together at different times. And at the end of the game, if you get to the last card and you survive without being taken over, and that's a tall order, you win a military victory. And there are different levels you can win, depending on how well you've done and how defeated enemy fronts are. But you can also win a political victory, by pushing this track at the bottom up, political track, up to 9 and optionally 10 if you're playing the slightly harder version of the game. Yeah, you've got two options, which is slightly different than most States of Siege game where you're just trying to survive. So you kind of have to try and play into the political side or the military side. I'll run through basically how it works. So you have this deck. I've drawn a card already. And what happens is you on each turn you draw a card. So you draw a card out, and then you see if there's, so in this case, no war, no peace. And then first you play the event. So in this case, there is no event. And then you advance tracks. So over here, I have the Baltic with the German armies, though they would advance. And then Finland would then advance, but they can't because they're not activated yet. And as the game goes through, different fronts will activate or deactivate depending on the situation. And then you've got the Eastern Front, which would advance, and then you've got the Southern Front that would advance. And all of these are converging on Moscow, and that's bad. And you want to try and push them back. So how do you push them back then? So you've got these numbers here. These are your operations that you can use or actions. And these can be used to push back a front. And how do you push back a front? So I'd spend one of my actions. I use these wooden markers. These actually don't come with the game, which I'll come to later. To push one of these back. So I would spend one on the southern front, and if I rolled above its DRM, so its difficulty is 3, so the number on it, I would push them back. And if I rolled any other lower number, I would fail to push them back. And then you can see Germany's higher, you see, so because it's stronger. So that's one use, and probably the most common use of your actions. The other use is to push up the political track, because if at any point in the game the political, the Russians, the Soviet, the Reds get too unpopular, the game loses, because it's a political game as much as a military one. So you start off as an international pariah, and you can try and push up to leftist sympathies, and then you can push up until the point where the Allies start giving up because they've got too much red activity at home, and it's politically unpopular to continue the war, and then eventually you can win that way. So that's the second action, and then the action type. And the third one is to use Red Army reorganization, which is basically so the Reds are basically they're getting together, but they've got a hodgepodge of forces. There's a lot of chaos in this game, and they're trying to deal with all these different threats. So what this represents is Trotsky primarily, one of the kind of Red Army leaders and creator of the Red Army. He's reorganizing the force and adding new elements. So, for example, you can get armored trains. But it's actually really hard to roll Red Army organization because you have to roll a 6, and it's a Hail Mary really. If you don't roll that 6, you don't get anything. But you have to play this really, because if you don't, without Red Army support, you just can't really survive. So you have to try and roll for it when you can, which is a great, interesting part of the game. And sorry, I forgot to mention with the political tracks, you do need to roll for the to beat a variety. So, for example, if you're an international pariah, your DRM is 3. So you need 4, 5, 6, but as it gets higher, it's harder. So by the time you get leftist sympathies, it's 5 or 6, and then allies indecisive, you need a 6. There are some ways to boost that up, including the Comintern in the Red Army reorg, but there are some other ways as well. Okay, so that's basically the game. Like really, you're pulling out these cards, you're reacting to the events. To give you an example of another event. So, for example, in the Hoffman offensive, no offences were allowed versus Baltic, so I couldn't roll against the Baltic, even though they've advanced, which could be very problematic. So what I'll do is just this game's really kind of thematic, and what I'll do is I'll go through each front to sort of give you an idea, and that give you a bit of the history and why each front's important, because there's every front is different. So we start off with Germany and the German Baltic, and what's important about the German Baltic is that this is the German armies in World War One. And as the game progresses, these are especially when you're starting off, these are the strongest force you're facing and probably the biggest threat, because what they can do is get to Petrograd, and they can just walk into Petrograd. And as soon as they walk into Petrograd, you lose political support, and he goes down. And right now I've only got one, so if they went into Petrograd, I'd go to 0 and I've lost the game. So it's very important early on to get sorry, the political level up a little bit higher, and so you don't to avoid this, because unfortunately they too tend to get into Petrograd before your military is stronger. So you can roll to try and push them out. There's a variant rule where might get a chance to get your political point back if they get pushed out of Petrograd, and I'll talk about the optional rules later. So Germany is your main threat. Now Germany can change as the war goes on. So what we'll see later is that the war, a truce can be called with Germany, which will then stop the Germans in their tracks, but that has other consequences. And then eventually Germany will leave the war, and you'll then get replaced with a Baltic kind of white front under Udeni. I'm probably pronouncing that wrong. But you get kind of nationalist forces there. Might be not nationalists, but essentially anti-communist forces in the Baltic. And they're less strong, basically. They're down to DRM3. So you want to get rid of Germany if you can. And then we're moving on to the Finns. Now the Finns are interesting because they don't come into the game straight away, and so it might be that you can see they're inactive. So every time they're told to advance, nothing's going to happen until they're active. So what could happen is that the Finns could be activated with a card quite early on, or they could be quite a lot later. So you can ignore them until they become active, basically. But they can also get upgraded to Mannerheim, who's a stronger leader than the original one, who I'm not even going to bother trying to pronounce. But Mannerheim might not come in until they're activated. He might come in before they're activated, and he doesn't necessarily activate the front when he comes in. So there's a lot of variety, and one thing we'll see about this game is that every time you play, it's really different. Which means you don't get the same experience every time, and you can't just use the same strategies every time, which I think is a real plus, which we'll get to later. Just put those Finns back, and then we've got the British. Now these don't tend to come in until you get what's called one of the biggest choices in the game, which I'll actually just sort of show you now. So you've got the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. So this could come in at any point in the Dust deck. So it could. The treaty could be signed like historically right at the end of the deck, or it could start early, and that opens up all sorts of opportunities. So you've got two options if that happens. You've got the first one is to accept the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, which basically takes Germany out of the war with Russia. Sorry, not Russia, with I guess it is Russia, yeah. So out of war with Russia, and the Germans continue fighting elsewhere. Or there's an alternative history, which is where Bukharin basically continues the war with Germany. But what this means is that the Allies, and what we mean by the Allies is the British and the US, they don't come into the war as a reaction to Germany basically leaving the war. So it's a very important decision, and it tends to be, if you go for Bukharin, you're going for a political style victory, because you get further cards that boost political points, and you can see it boosts a political point here. So how do the Allies stack up? Well, they're not probably the most dangerous front, because they don't do that much that often, but they're quite strong. They're strength 4, and they can creep up on you for sure. What's quite cool as well is if you get the political track up to Allies indecisive, the British and the US will become indecisive and won't advance. So if you're going for the political victory, you could possibly ignore them a little bit militarily, just to and wait. So the Brest-Litovsk is an absolute key kind of fork point in the game, and you need to decide your strategy based on that. So then in the east you have Kolchak, who is I think he's probably the most famous kind of white leader really in the war. I think there's a film called The Admiral, one of those kind of Russian sort of slightly propagandistic war films from the last 10-15 years. There's a kind of cool battle scene of kind of white soldiers advancing with music in like a brass band towards machine guns. It's kind of brutal, very unpleasant. It sort of shows that the kind of old and new tactics used. I'm not sure it was very historically accurate, but it definitely gets across the kind of the new world that this horrible war is creating. But anyway, Kolchak, he's one of your biggest threats, and you is very much a threat early in the game. Sorry, he's a bit of a threat earlier in the game because he might threaten the town of Ekaterinburg. Ekaterinburg, and if he goes there, there's a chance that the Tsar, who is the old leader of Russia, um, uh, basically the king of Russia, or the emperor, has been captured with his family and is being held by the Reds. And if the Kolchak gets to here or further, then basically the Tsar can be freed when a card's drawn, and that's bad for the Reds, because if he's free, what that means is that, and liberated, and goes off to America or whatever, that there is now a leader for the Whites, and it gives you a penalty to front attacks for the rest of the game, which is terrible, and it's probably a game over unless you have like some very good strong politics in play. So you really want to avoid it and focus on Kolchak early in the war. But there's another wrinkle for these guys as well. And just a quick historical aside, I don't know if you've ever heard of the story of Anastasia, but this is where the legend of her escaping her family's execution comes in, and well, the Don Bluth film based on that as well, of course, which is not probably real, but it's kind of cool. I love those sort of movies. Anyway, so the you've got Kolchak over in the east, and there's another wrinkle. You've got the Czech Legion. Now, Kolchak by himself isn't so much of a problem, but early on in the game, the Czech Legion turn up. Now, the Czech Legion were, I believe, supporting the Allies in the east, in Siberia. I don't quite know how they were fighting the Axis, but not the Axis, sorry, the Central Powers. They were fighting the Central Powers. And when the revolution happens, Trotsky basically tried to disarm them, because obviously he thought they might be reactionaries, going to stop the Reds. So they didn't like that, and they basically got in some armored trains and joined the Whites and caused all sorts of trouble for the Reds. So and I think they fought the Whites as well, but basically it's kind of an epic story of them surviving until they were evacuated. But what it does mean is that the Czech Legion adds a -1 DRM to the eastern front. I don't think they were actually with Kolchak, but they were, providing top cover, as it were, whilst he was doing his thing. And they're a real pain. So, and they don't go away until I think the Dawn deck. So as soon as the Czech Legion comes out, you've got a bigger problem in the east. So it's one of my least favorite cards to be drawn, basically. But very cool little bit of theme there. And then finally in the south we have Denikin, who he tends to come up quite a lot. I call him, he's quite insidious, and he'll turn up and try and deal with you. They're quite easy to deal with, the south, but they tend to advance quite a lot and you can get caught out. And they've got a nasty card where they'll continue advancing until you stop them. And that's caught me out, and I've lost on that card a few times. So always worth keeping in mind. And what's kind of cool as well is that both for a couple of the fronts, the southern and I believe the eastern, historically their leaders were either evacuated or a Kolchak was killed and captured, and you get a new leader to replace them, a nice token for that. Now, that doesn't have an effect on the game, but it's a nice bit of historical flavor, or fluff, or whatever you want to call it. Chrome, as the American wargamers call it. So that's the southern front. One I've probably lost to the most. And then finally we have the poles. Now the poles don't tend to activate until most of the way through the second deck, or they can come earlier, but and they are really interesting. I've not had too much. I played about 12 times, but the poles haven't caused me as much trouble as maybe it would be fun for them to do, because I tend to have either won or lost by the time they turn up, or they turn up so late they don't have an impact. But what the poles can do is that there's a couple of cards where they can advance twice, or one card where they can advance twice, which is never good. And they also, if they get to Kiev, they knock you down a political point, similar to Petrograd. So they're a big problem when they come into play. And then there's also a thing called the Curzon line, which is basically a political line drawn, and if the Soviets, so the Reds, cross it, it's basically essentially breaking a treaty of some sorts. I'm not fully sure on the history, and what it does is it knocks you down a political point. So if you're doing well politically, the Poles could really be a problem if they become a threat later in the game. So a cool little wrinkle for the late game there. And then finally, I think one of the really interesting parts of this game is that you can actually remove fronts. So these fronts can be permanently removed from the game if you're lucky and you push them all the way to the end of the track. That's one way. That the core rules basically say if you push them to the end of the track and you draw this card, you can remove a front permanently from the game, but there are some alternative rules to make this slightly easier for you. So yeah, I really like that. It's so satisfying removing a front that's bedeviled you for the entire game, and it's that sense of relief when you finally got rid of the Germans, or you've got rid of the Kolchak who's been bothering you for the last half an hour. So brilliant bit of design there, and satisfying. Okay, so that is all the fronts dealt with. So what other aspects have we got? So just a few things in addition to the political track and the Red Army reorganization. We've got the political dissent table. So at a certain point in the game, you'll have to roll for political dissent, which is a straight die roll. And if you get 1 or 2, you lose a political point. And if you get 5 or 6, you go up a political point. But if you what you can do is sacrifice operational or actions to basically give you a positive DRM, which means that you can potentially gain 2 political points. And this can be really useful, especially early on when you're a bit desperate for points, or if you're close to the end and you just want to go for victory. There's a nasty anarchist card that you can't use for anything. You can't boost that one up. It just rolls for political dissent. And the nasty thing about that anarchist card is that it can turn up again in the deck if you draw it earlier on. So yeah, really cool little bit of a wrinkle, because anarchists were yet another faction. You had the Greens and certain anarchist groups within them, and peasant rebels and anarchists in the south, just add to the mix of forces going on in this kind of chaotic and sort of disastrous war for people involved, because so many people were killed in this war. Is absolutely unbelievable, and a lot of the 20th century horrors started here basically. Yeah, so political dissent there, and then final thing is you have reserves and political decrees. So these are like a finite pool of resources that can be spent. So the reserve offensives, these basically you can roll for a free attack, but you can't use any DRMs on it. Now there's a nice variant rule which I use, where basically you can use this to boost the DRM of a normal attack up, because I feel like it's a bit unreliable if not, and it's just nice, feels a bit more satisfying to boost up a roll you've just about missed and spend a reserve on it. So that's cool. And then but you've only got 5, and once they're gone, they're gone. And political decree is similar. You can use this on the political track, or you can use them on the Red Army reorg. Seems a little inefficient to use them on Red Army reorg because it has to be a 6, but there are times when you might want to take that approach. One minor thing I would say is I would think these could be a little stronger, or would be nice if these could add a DRM as well, but I think I understand why they don't want to make the political track even more unbalanced, because it already is a slight get out of jail free card in this game. Yeah, okay, cool. So sorry, they're going through quite a lot of mechanics here, but that I think we've almost got it covered. And then finally we've got I'll go for a little bit more detail on the Red Army reorg, just so you understand that. So you've got the checker. Now I play the variant where the checker, which is the secret police, is available at the beginning of the game, and this allows you to basically skip a card. So you get a nasty card that's going to lose you the game, you can skip it, and then you can get 2 free actions. Really good. And you can redraw it as soon as you've used the checker. You could re-roll for it again. Tank Corps, pretty cool. You have to attach them to a front, so you don't want to move them around too much, but they give you a DRM boost, so dice roll modifier. Armoured Train, my favorite. 1 per turn you get a DRM boost and on any front. So it's a great sort of firefighter, as it would make sense in real life. And I like to slide the token up the train tracks as it deals with the different fires going on. Probably the most powerful military one is applied experience. So these are the officers boosting up the army, and because you can basically roll after every attack. And then you've got communist subversion, which is probably the most interesting because this allows you, as I said before, to swap around the actions and the enemy front advancements. Because if you can deal with the fronts first, then you can stop like horrible losses, because you've got a few more rolls just to stop a front that's about to hit you. As I say, these get discarded at the end of a deck. So when a new deck comes in, you have to discard it, but you can redraw it. And then finally, you've got common term, which I think I explained. You can boost up the politics. And then really cool, you've got the Imperial Gold Reserve. So if you basically roll for one that you've already got, so for example, if I roll 1, the checker's already out, I'd pick up the Gold Reserve. And this gold can be used to block an enemy attack. So great to defend like Moscow on a final, pay off the army that's coming into Moscow. Or it can be used to set a die roll to any number, which has got all sorts of uses. Maybe could win you the game by just getting that final victory on the political track. But I've used it a few times when I've rolled on Reddit Army Reorg, and then I've failed my second roll to get anything, because if you get an empty slot and there's no gold, you fail the reorg. You could just then pick the number and pick the reorg you want. Now, it's probably not the most efficient use of the gold, but it certainly helps me pick my strategy, and I quite like to be able to select it, even at my own kind of, I guess, losing my money. So that's kind of the Red Army reorg. Really adds a lot of flavor. So what you've managed to roll affects the game, and if you roll too many times on it, you've got less to pick from, and as a result, you've more chance to fail. Okay, so those are the rules of the game, really. It tends to work through. You either get a relatively early political victory by basically, playing the Bukharan option and rolling as much as you can on the political tables, and you can maybe squeak one in. I do recommend using the optional 10 because it can be a bit easy to get the political victory, and it feels a little bit cheap, maybe. But it's on 10. It's actually really difficult because you have to roll so many times, and you can get it so military is beginning to collapse, and you're just like, okay, I've got to get these final political rolls, but I need to keep these fronts from, being just up to Moscow. And then the other way is to get, as I say, to get through the whole decks. Now that's much harder. Now what I have found is when you're going through there, when you do win, you start winning quite a lot, and then you might knock out quite a few fronts, and then it becomes a little bit easier in the late game. Now the polls throw in a little bit of a wrinkle here, and make the game a bit harder. But it can be that when you do win the military victory, which is hard, but if you do win it, you will tend to win quite a high score, I think, because you tend to knock out a few fronts. So that's maybe something they could have changed a little bit, because I haven't managed to get like a minor victory yet, and it sort of like loses some of the incentive to play again on the military victory. So cool. Let's have a look then at it, just quickly, like going through some of the presentation of the game before we go into like what I really liked about the gameplay. So or didn't like. So first of all, Worthington's knocked it out of the park again with presentation. So we've got an absolutely beautiful board. We've got great components, like chits, like everything looks spot on. The card quality is great. They're very easy to read. They've got nice descriptions of the history on each card, and you can play the game historically if you want in order. Now, I wouldn't recommend it because it's too hard, and it sort of, you lose some of the alternative history of the game, but it's nice to just flick through the cards and just follow the history. You've got a really nice rule book, which is really clear. But I do have some critiques. Now, one, there's like a couple of typos, like very small. I think like you've got Kuz Online rather than Kurs Online, for example. But I think on the earlier map they released, there were more typos. Now, there is an issue with this map. I don't know if you've noticed it, but I've had to put cubes on this map because there aren't um, the slots for each one are for cubes that don't come with the game. These are from a different game, these cubes. And instead, these larger counters that the game comes with don't fit the slots. And I was like, why is this? Now, the game used to have, on the first release of this deluxe edition, it had a different map. I don't know if it was slightly bigger, but it basically would fit these bigger tokens. And they've changed that now for some reason. I think this map is maybe slightly cleaner, a bit nicer. For some reason, it's missing the red star in Moscow. I kind of wish it did have that because it looks cool. But it's now perfectly workable for cubes. Now, but the cubes work fine, but they don't come with the game, and the markers look a bit stupid on top of the slots. So it's just a weird oversight. I don't really know what happened there. I'm happy with the cubes, and I use the tokens as well just to represent. It does feel a bit off. That's all I can say. No big deal. You're not going to have any problems really. It's just an aesthetics thing. And then the rule book, as I say, is really nicely done, like really clear. Like every card has an explanation. Like I barely had to like look up anything in the game. I think there were a couple of like maybe small mistakes I made. It only lets itself down in one area, which is the optional expansion rules. So the original Soviet Dawn had an expansion pack that was released, I think, under a different designer from the original designer. And it's got some really cool rules that add a bit of nuance to the game, maybe make it a little bit easier, especially on the military side. And I would recommend playing with these once you've got a bit further in the game. But there are some very unclear rules here. The rest of the game is pretty clear. This is less clear, and I think some of this comes from it's just like a poor copy from the original rules. I've actually seen the original rules online. They're not particularly clear either, but they're not as unclear in this, and it's just a shame because everything else is so good. Now, the other issue with these optional rules is it doesn't really tell you how to use them. Like which set should you use? Should you use one? Should you use all? Should it affect your score? And I think it just makes you kind of have to cherry pick a little bit. And now there's a really kind of cool bit with the rules, optional rules, where you've got like these rooted British terminology, but routed in American, and you've got disorganization as well, which basically is if you roll a 6 when attacking a front using this variant, it will disorganize an enemy front, which will then put it into a state of where it can't advance until it's removed that token. If you rolled another 6, it would become routed, and then as a result, you would need to use twice. It would have to advance twice before it started moving. Now, there's a flip side to this because this is obviously very powerful for the player. If you roll a 1, the front actually will advance rather than go. You fail, and you have to roll twice, and you need to see if you roll under the number on the track, or including I think the number that the token's on the track, and it will advance. But it's still like it can be really dicey, like especially if they're near Moscow, because could be doing quite well and roll a few ones, and then suddenly Moscow's overtaken. There's also a nice variant which basically means the game doesn't end when you get into Moscow. You can push them out the front out of Moscow, but you've got a -1 DRM. Now, just going back to the disorganized rule, there's a bit of an ambiguity about how this works when you push a front to the end of the track. Now, what it says from my understanding of the rules, and there's a bit of dispute I've seen on Board Game Geek over this, that if you push back the front, so if Finland was back here, you don't need to roll a 6 to disorganize them. You can just roll normally, and if you beat them, you just disorganize, which allows for I would call front pinning, where you can just push a front back and keep it back, which makes the game too easy and it's a bit gamey. Now, I disagree, though. There's an assessment by a kind of a key community member who is an absolute legend of the community, but he basically says that this should have been always on a 6 even at the end, but I don't think that's right. Basically, the designer has basically stated otherwise, and but it is too powerful. So my compromise would be, if you do play with this, is just put a -1 DRM when attacking at this end of the front, and I call this just like out of supply rule. So basically, you're attacking right at the end of the front. You've lost your supply lines, so you're basically just it makes this like, so you still get an advantage for for pinning at the back, but it's a bit weaker. So that's just for me. That's my own house rule. You don't need to use it. Do not absolutely know that I've got that right in the ruling, but it's just it makes more sense to me that way. And as I say, there's another variant where you start with a checker. Yeah, so okay, so that's in terms of the presentation side. I'm going to say very, very good, just with a few deluxe edition oddities. It looks a lot better than the original game did, which has that kind of like early 2010s, like slightly kind of made in a garage feel to it, which no disrespect to it, just it's just those older games look a little bit more homemade. But this feels like, you know, GMT level beautiful presentation. Worthington, I don't know how you do it. It is incredible. But because they don't release a errata for these deluxe editions, you often find you're having to like look things up in forums because any differences between the games aren't really clearly stated, and it's just a bit of a mess in that respect. And I had that with the Cruel Necessity as well, where I had to use community errata basically to work out any errors on the game. I don't think this one plays, the deluxe edition is much different than the original edition in terms of gameplay. I think there maybe are some very small variations in the rules, but like they're almost nothing. So if you had the older version of the game, I wouldn't necessarily buy a new book copy. Cool. So what do I actually? So we've gone on about how the game works and the production, but is this game any good? The answer is yes, it really is. It is a really fun one, and if you kind of wanted a States of Siege game, you can't really go wrong with this one. Now, what does it add? What makes it great? Now, this game is at its best, I think it's a great alternative history simulator. That's its strongest position. The three decks and the way that they can essentially become merged at different points and on different games at different times means that, say, well, one could end early, or the truce could end early. The Germans could leave the war, or stay in it. The Poles could not get involved really early on and cause you trouble, you know, just after the World War I has started, or it could be right at the end of the war that Podolsky comes through and starts causing the Reds trouble. So and what's great about that, the unpredictability means that you can't really use a set strategy. You need to adapt and think about what you're doing to deal with the threats in front of you. The other kind of cool thing is I think there's a real sense of like chaos and desperation, which I feel like gets the impression of these kind of maverick communists, Trotsky, Lenin, making up as they go along, coming up with these kind of insane policies that some of them work, some of them don't. But they have this kind of freedom and flexibility that the whites and their allies don't have, because they're essentially operating in a new political space. And I think it captures that, like the reserve offensive, the political decrees, the Red Army reorg, it sort of has this feel of like new ideas coming in. Let's see what sticks. And you just kind of get that. Can imagine like sweaty in the Politburo, and Politburo probably didn't exist. I don't even know, but just I had this feeling of like being, you know, my hairline's as almost as gone as Lenin's is anyway, but you know, just sitting sweating over a desk, sending out telegrams on armored trains, like, deal with this front, go here, we need to deal with the kulaks in the south. Just that sense of like anxious desperation trying to deal with these endless threats. One thing I forgot to mention, actually, you can fortify Petrograd, which I really like, to block it from being captured so easily. Just another little nuance in the game. So excellent stuff there. And so the variety is great. The reorg and how you can kind of like build up a unique strategy based on what your reorg table has taken. Things like the Czech Legion and the Tsar like add historical flavor. Like one of the kind of criticisms of States of Siege can be a bit dull, like pushing back tracks. I think the optional rules really spice that up a bit and make it a little bit less like one note, just attacking fronts. Every front is different. There's no identical fronts. And it's hard as well. I mean, it's not impossible. Like I didn't feel like it was completely brutal, that it couldn't win. I have won a few times, but it does feel difficult. Like it's not an easy one. Now you could argue that political victory is quite easy, but I would say if you set it to 10, it actually is quite hard. So just keep it at 10 and you'll be fine. 10 points for victory. Now, what would I kind of like criticize a little bit? I would say that randomness. This is probably one of the more even, because the card draws are quite random. When the decks come in are random, there is a lot of luck in this game, and all that's with all states of siege. But you could just get really unlucky with your card draws and just essentially have impossible odds stacked against you, and that's just how it's going to run. And I think it's just best just to run through that kind of unfair hand of history and enjoy it, rather than throwing the game away out in frustration because it's kind of giving you a bad run. It's so easy to set up and start again that you can just get going. And yeah, I think there's that aspect to it. And I think just a few little things, like I think most of my main issues, like the optional rules, like kind of make the game better, but it's not clear which ones to use, and I think they should maybe alter the scores basically on what you're using, to give you, because I just felt playing with all the optional rules, it's making it slightly easier. Have I won the game? That's maybe me being too pedantic, but I always felt, do I need to win this like vanilla to feel I've won it? I don't know, that's maybe just a me thing. And also, I mean, it's more of a slight disappointment. The polls come in very late in the game, and like they've got loads of cool rules, but I barely ever saw them, because if you're winning political victory, you're winning normally in the grey darkness deck. And if every time I've got to the final few cards, the polls have only come out in the last few card draws. And that's just, I guess, my luck playing. But they've got a load of cool rules, and I barely seen them do anything. Yeah, I mean that's basically it. I mean, the Red Army reorg, I think, is one of those things which will either you'll think is brilliant or really frustrate you, because you have to roll a 6, and if you roll 5 ones in a row, which I've done, it's annoying as hell. But it is. But when you get those 6s and you get the reorg you wanted, it is brilliant. So at some point I'll do a run through of like my favorite States of Siege games. I've only played a few now, and I haven't played the real classics like Ottoman Sunset and Habsburg Eclipse. So I think I'll wait to compare them. But just like Cruel Necessity, this is a great reworking by Worthington, and thanks to them for just making another great game, and thanks to Darin Levioff, who created this originally, to coming up with such a brilliant system. So this is a definite buy from me. If you can get hold of it, I think it's pretty cheap I thought like really heavily discounted on Worthington's website. So, and at the time of this video, so get out there, get this. You can't really go wrong. A great starter States of Siege game. Okay, thanks for listening. Bye.